Hello, I'm Virginia from Right Clinic, and here with me today is Peter Llewellyn from MedComms Networking. Thank you for joining us today, Peter. So
Thank
why
you
don't
for
we start
asking.
with
Thank you.
you? Sorry. So why don't we start with you telling us a little about yourself and what you do?
Okay, so my name's Peter Llewellyn, and for what it's worth, I would welcome anybody reaching out to me on LinkedIn, where you can find out all about me. It's all quite open. I guess I'm known at the moment for, or have been for a number of years, for running MedComms Networking and the various associated websites. So medcommsnetworking.com, you'll find lots of information and resources for people who work in and around medcoms. And by that, I mean the global community of people who work in and around medical communications, medical education, medical publishing, and the associated businesses. And there's a number of websites you can look at. First Medcoms Job is worth looking at if you're interested in coming into medcoms. It's a lots of advice for people trying to get a job. Network Pharma TV, there's more than 500 videos now on all manner of things to do with medcoms. So I run that community of professionals across the globe. Basically, that's what I do. I try and champion the business, and I try and support people trying to get into the business, and I try and basically encourage people in and around medcoms to talk to each other. That's fundamentally what it's about.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So first question is, why did you set up MedComms Networking 20 years ago, I think? So it's been around for a long time and you kept it
Yeah.
going.
Yeah, no, it's strictly speaking, it's coming up to 17. But yes, as you say, it's been around a while. It started very much in a very casual way. There's a long story and a short story. Probably would stick with the short story, but basically, if you can take your mind back 17 years, Peter, medcoms wasn't really there as a sort of business, as a sort of community. People didn't really talk about medcoms. It was much more either advertising, PR, or med ed, which was the business that I'd grown up in a little bit. And medcoms we were starting to talk about. Frankly, I'm sitting here in Oxford in the UK, where I was then, and a number of us were talking and saying it would be fun to get people together who worked in this medcoms. Although, as I say, we didn't articulate it in quite that way. But it was people who we'd worked with. Oxfordshire was a bit of a cluster of those sorts of businesses. Let's get people together in a bar and have a drink and meet up with people who we haven't seen for a while. It was as literally as silly as that. And in January of 2007, I sent out a bunch of emails to people and said, hey, we're going to go into this bar. And a few of us put some money behind the bar. We're going to have a bit of a free bar and a bit of just a networking do. And within 5 days, there were too many people for the venue and so on. And then a lot of pressure to do more. So we discovered we actually liked each other and wanted to talk to each other, and pressure to do more. I ran another social networking do like that. But very early on, I said, well, if I'm going to do more of this, we're going to do educational type work, and we're going to try and make this more useful than just me running parties for people who were in this sort of medcoms business. And, as a slightly flippant way of looking at it, but basically that's what happened. And it evolved from there, just doing stuff for people within this sort of community, which was sort of forming around this word medcoms. And it does seem a long, long time ago now, but over the years, we've gone on from those sort of social networking type evenings and educational type activities to doing work at all sorts of levels. And as I say, mostly online. In terms of the information is online, but a lot of face-to-face type meetings. And then over the last 5 years, increasingly doing video conferencing and so on. And with the pandemic, obviously pushing us a little bit further in that direction. But I was already doing a lot of Zoom meetings before most people had heard of Zoom sort of thing, because it just transformed the way I was working. I was able to talk, for instance, with the New Zealand medical writers and run meetings with them. And I just love the fact that technology allowed me to do things like that. And it was all about just getting this community talking to each other and championing the community and good practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. And I wanted to ask, what are your kind of long-term goals and mission? It sounds like it's very much community-based and getting people to talk to each other, and you're doing that through setting up events. So how do you plan to kind of reach the kind of longer-term goal or bigger picture goal?
It's very difficult to answer that question because, in truth, I'm not sure I know what's happening next month, let alone next year, let alone 5 years' time. And the history of MedComms networking and the various activities around it has very much been me trying to respond to the community. It's an odd beast because it's not a membership organisation. I haven't got a membership. I haven't got committees of people planning things. I talk about me and Teddy, basically, my teddy bear, running activities that try and support this community and try to respond to what they want to do. So I think we've done a good job of drawing attention to MedComms as a business and helping form that community. Not that many years ago, it was talked about as an invisible business. It's less invisible now. But it's still, a lot of people out there don't know much about MedComms. And there's still a lot of confusion about medical writing and what the different sorts of medical writing are. And, I argue that MedComms is a very specialist form of medical writing. It's a narrow niche on a very broad spectrum of activity. I think we've got a lot of work to do still just to get that message out to people of what we actually do within the industry. But also importantly outside the industry. So in terms of promoting careers in MedComms, either as medical writers, editors, account managers, whatever, explaining what we're doing and the breadth of service and the way it's changing. It's no longer, if it ever was, about writing publications for peer-reviewed journals. That's still a big part of what we do. But MedComms these days is very, very broad. Whether you look at the digital type aspects or the educational type aspects, and it's about talking to different audiences. It's not just HCPs anymore, medics and so on. So different sorts of people are coming into the business and the range of services are expanding. So my role, frankly, as long as I can keep it going and as long as the community are happy to support it, I will continue to champion the business, encourage people to take a look at it and hopefully support people in terms of coming into the business. But if you were talking to my accountants and said, what's the long-term business? The truth is this is a very strange beast. I'm supported by sponsors of one sort or another. And, at the end of the day, they can change their mind and go, well, it's not worth supporting anymore. It's quite a precarious existence. So, so that probably doesn't really answer the question beyond saying that I'm going to be led by the community. I think we've got a long way to go in terms of telling more people about MedComms. MedComms is maturing, but has a way to go and will undoubtedly be very different in a few years' time. How can I support and respond to that community as long as I'm allowed to, sort of thing? Does that answer the question? It's not a very, very precise answer, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's admirable to kind of keep going where you're going and keeping it up. And also kind of, maybe there isn't a destination. Maybe it's more about the journey and how it develops and being part of that, which is really amazing. And I was going to ask you, because you mentioned sponsored, how do you choose the sponsors? Is there kind of a criteria that they need to meet? Are there sponsors that you've had to turn away? And how do sponsors support what you're doing?
Well, the basics are very, very simple. And if you go to MedCommsNetworking.com, you see a bunch of companies are acknowledged as sponsors. They are MedComms companies, basically. So so the idea is that the MedComms companies, the community, if you like, supports the community initiative, as it were, by sponsorship. For what it's worth, it's a very simple model. It's not a huge amount of money. Everybody's treated the same, but with a bunch of them joining in, then that's a pot of money that I can use. We also have various people who've got a commercial interest, I guess, in MedComms, maybe advertising or whatever. And you'll see some other logos or banners or advertising across what I do. To be honest, not a lot. The bulk of the funding comes through those sponsors. So if somebody's interested in supporting the community and being seen to be supporting the community, that's the argument, is if you're in this community and you want to be seen as a leader in the community, then why wouldn't you support the community initiative? And it's a very simple deal and it gets you a lot of exposure and a lot of support. If you're not in this community, then A, you don't tend to talk to me in the first place, and B, I tend to go, well, you're not quite the right sort of person. But that's, so it's not like I choose or they choose. It's more these things are discussed. Certainly always interested in more people supporting us. And my line is always, I'd rather have more people sponsoring us than put up the prices, for instance. So sponsors haven't, the deal hasn't changed in years. I just like the fact that from time to time we can add some more people in, sort of thing. And then again, the sponsors then act as a sort of a sounding board, and I hope they will guide me a little bit more than the rest of the community. But it's very much driven by the community. So how much do they want to get involved and so on. And there's various other things. I run a certain number of activities and events where it becomes very simple. If you want to join in, there is a cost attached to it. So, I run some face-to-face meetings, careers meetings and so on, where there is a price to have an exhibition stand. But the bulk of it is people within this community saying, yes, we think this is useful and we will put a modest but useful amount of money in. And for that, we will get recognition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really interesting to hear. And I also wanted to ask you, how do you see the landscape of MedComms changing over the next, how have you experienced it over the past 5 years, and what do you think is going to happen in the next 5 years?
So again, we have to be careful with these discussions, because it's like, how do you define MedComms? And a bunch of us in the room together will define it differently. So I'm coming at it from my point of view, which will be slightly different from some other people's points of view. But if we take MedComms as being that sort of scientific end of the spectrum, it's not the sort of CME, IME type end of education. It's not the PR advertising. It's certainly not the journalistic side of medical writing. It's the science and technical end of the spectrum. Fundamentally, in terms of the last 5 years, I would argue that it's boomed. There's been a lot of attention, and that's partly driven just by there's a lot of data coming out of the industry that needs to be shared and communicated. A lot of companies take the view now, which they didn't necessarily take a number of years ago, that everything that we do has to be published. That's a mountain of information that needs to be published. And there's a lot of interest in not just publishing in a peer-reviewed publication where it's not looked at. The whole point is to get people to access that information and open up access. So, for instance, I mean, there's a lot of different things we could throw in here, but as an example, if you take that very fundamental sort of publication of trial data, there's a whole, over the last few years, there's been massive amount of development in terms of opening up access to those publications using enhanced techniques, video, abstracts, infographics, podcasting, all the rest of it. The publishers, I mean, if you look back at some of the webcasts I've done over the last few years, I have a sort of traditional Meet the Publishers thing every December now. And you look back and you go, we've been talking about some of this for years. But there's been real progress over the last couple of years. So you can do much more now than just put a paper in a journal. You can do all sorts of things to increase access to it. So that's part of the digitization. It's part of opening up access. It's part of recognizing that more people need access to this information. And that's not just healthcare professionals. So a lot of it with plain language summaries and things, there's a big debate, frankly, about what plain language summaries are really about. I would argue they're not just about patient information, but again, there's debate around those terminologies. But plain language summaries, as an example, opens up access to the scientific content. And if you go through to the patient end of things, a lot of interest now in involving patients in what we're doing. Now, again, a lot of MedComms, I would argue, is not particularly directed at patients as such, although definitions vary. But a lot of companies now have got patients involved in the activities, whether it's on some sort of review body or, taking the patient voice on board sort of thing. But there's a spectrum of activity, and some companies are doing much more directly to patients. So there's differences in terms of the audiences. There's difference in terms of the way in which stuff's done, and certainly use of digital and online education and so on and so forth. There's a whole load of stuff we can talk about there. The range has increased. So HEOR, market access type work, for instance, which and real world evidence and so on. There's increased range there. Another side of looking at what's happened in the last few years is the difference in working practice. There'd probably be some people who disagree with me, but I would argue up to the pandemic, we were traveling in a direction where people were working more flexibly. There was more virtual working. Still, a lot of agencies would say, yes, we work flexibly, but what they meant was you had a laptop and you could do some work at home if that's what you wanted to do in the evening. That's not really virtual working and flexible working in the way that we probably now understand it. And over the pandemic, everyone's pushed at home, and they discovered that actually we can work like this. And it accelerated the move towards sort of more virtual and flexible working. The interesting question, I guess, now is post-pandemic as to where the balance is going to end up. I think most people agree that a sort of a hybrid way of working is probably going to suit most people and most organizations. But there are plenty of organizations now that are completely virtual. And there's interesting debate around some of those working practices. But the opportunities are much greater now for people to work much more flexibly. So there's that aspect as well. And if you look forward, I think what you're seeing is just more of all of that. So you're seeing more obviously more digitization, more different formats, more, there'll be more video work and podcasting and infographics and stuff, visualization of data, much more important now than it used to be. Lots more attention paid to things like learning sort of techniques and so on, and understanding how people learn from information and take on board information. But also, I would hope much more attention being paid to what actually is an outcome. So I think in MedComms, we used to be quite bad at measuring outcomes. It would be sort of, did we have a room full of people at this standalone meeting? And in MedComms, I think we were a bit behind the line in terms of, well, that doesn't matter how many people are in the room. What matters is who they are and what they do as a result. If you go into CME type circles, you'll find there's been a lot more attention paid to that over the years. So I think MedCom specifically will be much more about looking at outcomes and measuring outcomes. And that's more complicated than it sounds, sort of thing. So it requires an investment and much more engagement with those different audiences, and particularly with the patients. It'll just become more and more about the patients, but also the working practices. As I said, it'll just be interesting to see where we get the balance in terms of just how far we go and how virtual this business is. But, you know yourself, you can work remotely. It does work. But if you take the new people coming into the business, there's also very, very strong arguments for saying, come into a business and into an office and learn from people around you and so on. So that, I think, is a work in progress. But again, that was a bit of random. Does that sort of, give you a flavour of at least where I'm seeing things going?
Yeah, I think, the way that we work is definitely changing, and the kind of outcomes of our work and the way that we publish is definitely changing as well, because we've got, as you said, digitization, people consuming things in different ways. And so you've got an event coming up in Heathrow in London. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I guess since this is being recorded for future reference, I guess we should be specific and say, this is coming up in September. It's September the 25th. So I'm afraid if you're listening to this after September 25th, it's not coming up anymore. But basically, I'm running another event at Heathrow, which we're calling Working in and Around MedComms. It's basically a careers event. We ran one last year, which was very successful. Hopefully this one will be successful as well. It's primarily about getting people who want to understand the business. So entry-level type people coming to Heathrow for the day. We should have a lot of people there. We've got a lot of leading employers there, primarily MedComms, but there's quite a range of experience there on the day. So I'm very keen on that, because a lot of people drawn towards MedComms. I'm not really sure what MedComms is about. I mean, we've said our own definitions vary, so you can't blame people. But they're interested in medical writing, or they're interested in communications work, account management work, and so on. And I'm very keen that when people come to one of our sort of careers meetings, particularly this sort of one that we're doing at Heathrow, that they can go, they can meet people who are more involved in advertising, PR, regulatory writing, HUR, or whatever, journal publishing, and so on. And we will have a lot of people there with a lot of experience of different types of work. So hopefully we can help people, in the course of a day. And I certainly recommend people come for the day. Start early, finish late. There's refreshments, there's a free bar, whatever. It's all about coming and meeting people. Alongside of having an exhibition, we've got workshops throughout the day with various experts and agencies and employers running workshops and interactive sessions of one sort or another. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of different ways in which someone can come and get a feel for the sort of business we're talking about, the sort of people that are involved in the business, and have the opportunity to talk to some really quite interesting people. So frankly, the important point for anybody looking to come in as an entry level is it's completely free of charge. Come and join us for a day and have some fun. We know we've changed people's lives at some of these events, basically. So please come along and join in. Networkpharma.careers is the place to go and have a look and see what's going on.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. So if you're listening to this and it's before September 25th, 2023, then be sure to check out medcommsnetworking.com. And I'm sure Peter will be posting about it on LinkedIn as well. So connect with Peter,
Yeah.
leave links, relevant links in the description box below so you can click and connect with Peter.
Yeah.
So
maybe worth just putting in the, use hashtag MedComms. That's what I keep banging on about to people, whatever platform you're on, particularly on LinkedIn. There's activity with hashtag MedComms. And certainly that's where I put my content. So you can do worse than follow that hashtag and you'll pick up a lot of useful information, insights into the business.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, well, I will hopefully chat to you again in future and we'll see what's changed in the world of MedComms. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank
Bye.
you, Virginia. Cheers. Take care. Bye.